So now the House case appears to be nearing a settlement. College football realignment is going to heat up once again. And a lot of people are wondering what happens to the ACC schools, specifically Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, and Virginia. What do they do next? Now, in order to determine an answer to that question, I figured we look at two key factors in this whole equation. Number one, money, and number two, miles. So let's go ahead and get started with the money. Now, I'm not a TV executive, so I don't have exact figures from Fox or ESPN, but what I do have is the number of people who watch each of these teams every week. And I'll combine that with whether or not these teams provide a new market to either the Big Ten or the SEC. And with those two factors, we can get a pretty good idea of what the value of each of these universities are. So starting off with TV viewership for Florida State, we see an astounding 4.16 million viewers per week. Now, FSU had a great 2023 season. They were undefeated in the regular season. They won their conference. We won't talk about what happened in the postseason, but it was a wonderful 2023 for Florida State. They are getting over 4 million people to tune into their games each and every week. And that is something that both the Big Ten and SEC certainly would be interested in. Now, as we switch graphics, we can see that Florida State provides a new market to the Big Ten. They do not provide a new market for the SEC. Next up, Clemson University. Clemson had, not a bad, but not a great 2023 season. They finished 9-5. But they still brought in almost 3 million viewers each and every week in 2023. So that is a solid amount of followers for any college football team. And that's something that, again, either the Big or the SEC would be quite interested in. Much like Florida State, Clemson brings a new market to the Big Ten. They do not bring a new market to the SEC. Moving on to the University of North Carolina, the Tar Heels averaged almost 2 million viewers per week in 2023. Now, what's interesting, though, as we switch the graphic again, for North Carolina, they provide a new market for both the Big Ten and the SEC. So they bring solid viewership, but probably more importantly, they provide an entirely new geographical area for both conferences. And that is what makes North Carolina especially powerful. Finally, University of Virginia, the Cavs are not exactly a football powerhouse, finishing 3-9 last season. And they also brought in a little less than 1 million viewers per week. So on the surface, a lot of people would say, well, man, why is Virginia even in this conversation? And here's why they're in the conversation. We see that Virginia provides a new market for both the Big Ten and the SEC. So with Virginia, their value is not so much in what they're doing right now. The value is in what they will do and what they will provide their new conference in the future. So each of these four schools has value. Of the four in order, I would rank Florida State, North Carolina, Clemson, and then Virginia as far as monetary value for either the Big Ten or the SEC. Now let's take a look at travel. Travel is one of those underestimated factors in college football realignment. A lot of people dismiss the idea of travel altogether. They say, well, there's only 6 football road games each and every year, and they've got jets now. What's the problem? The problem is this. You also have to take into account the other sports that come along for the ride, namely the Olympic sports. The increase of travel is going to present some problems for some of the Olympic sports of these schools. Now, is that enough to make anyone change their mind about realignment? Of course not. Of course not. But it is something to consider. When we start with Florida State, we see a huge disparity in travel comparing the Big Ten to the SEC. For Florida State, the average road trip to a Big Ten opponent is over 1,300 miles on the ground. Now, traveling the air, that narrows the distance down to about 1,100 miles, but still, that is a long way to go. That's just the one-way trip out to the destination. You compare that to the SEC, and we see almost a 3 times differential. SEC road trips for Florida State, much more manageable. And there's just no other way to say that. It's going to be a long haul if Florida State joins the Big Ten, especially when you compare that travel to the SEC. For Clemson, it's not much better. You see the average road trip for Clemson's 1,100 on the ground, a little over 900 in the air. And again, that's just one way. That's just to the average Big Ten opponent. Again, going to the SEC, the road trip's much more manageable. So over 2 times the amount of travel for Clemson if they go to the Big Ten compared to if they move to the SEC. For North Carolina, that travel difference narrows just a little bit, but still for the Tar Heels, there really is no comparison here. Traveling to the SEC will be much easier compared to traveling to the Big Ten. Finally, Virginia Cavaliers, the distance between the two conferences lessens just a little bit more, but still, travel advantage goes to the SEC. So, okay, we've seen some factors. We've seen TV viewership, we've seen new markets, we've seen travel. What's it all mean? What's going to happen next? Florida State is the next domino to fall in the realignment game. And I've got Florida State going to the Big Ten. Unlike the other 3 schools in this list, FSU has a ton of private equity on tap. They've got all the money they need to move from the ACC tomorrow. It doesn't really matter how big the exit fee is, they've got the jack to make the move. And because of that, and their animosity towards ESPN and to a lesser extent the SEC, I've got Florida State going to the Big Ten. I think their passion rules the day, and they make the move for the 2025 season to move to the Big Ten Conference. Moving on to the Clemson Tigers, I got the exact opposite scenario happening here. A lot of people predicting Clemson and Florida State to go to the Big Ten together. I don't see that happening at all. I've got Clemson going to the SEC. Because Florida State has all the money in the world and they can tell ESPN and the SEC to go to hell, they go to the Big Ten. When that happens, the SEC is not going to just allow another 3 million viewers per week to go up to the Big Ten country. They're going to see the value of Clemson being the number of eyeballs tuning into that program each and every week. Additionally, I think ESPN will help finance ACC teams' move to the SEC. And as Greg Pflugar and C.W. Lambert have discussed, this means that teams like Clemson can literally move to the SEC with little to no money down. Next up, North Carolina. I've got the Tar Heels going to the SEC. Now, as we discussed earlier, North Carolina provides a new market for either of the Power 2 conferences. But I think it's going to be a lot easier for the Tar Heels to make their way into the SEC than it will be to go to the Big Ten. And unlike Florida State, there is not $500 million of private equity just kind of waiting and hanging around to see what the Tar Heels do next. I think that ease of movement as well as the pro-SEC faction in North Carolina, I think their passion rules the day, and the Tar Heels enter the Southeastern Conference in the very near future. Now, this one's going to go against the grain for a lot of prognosticators out there. I've got Virginia going to the SEC. Now, at the end of the day, I think Virginia goes to the SEC for 2 reasons. Number one, it's going to be a lot easier. As discussed earlier, that ACC exit fee is probably going to be pretty substantial. If they can move now and pay later and start making SEC money right away, that's an opportunity you jump at. You don't wait, you don't hesitate, you just go for it. So when this round of realignment is over, I've got Florida State moving to the Big Ten, and Clemson, North Carolina, and Virginia all making their way to the Southeastern Conference. This would leave both of those leagues with 19 teams each, with more expansion likely on the horizon. As always, this is Kevin in Texas saying God bless you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.